Thank you guys for coming out tonight for Night of Fairy Tales, a wonderful reading of Oz. This evening celebrates the L. Frank Baum series as fairy tale, as interdisciplinarity, and as possibility space. There are too many people to thank individually for this spectacular evening, and all of our fabulous co-sponsors and amazing readers, from undergraduate students to professors, are listed in the program you have in your hands. So the readers will not be introducing themselves, but you can see who they are as they come up. We want a real flow of excerpts from the Baum series when the readings start. But before we begin, I should send out a special thank you to our major sponsor, the College of Humanities, and a real gratitude to their external relations team, Nate, Jenna, Helen, Amanda, and Melissa, who have brought together so many amazing decorations and technology tonight. And the Fairy Tale Review editorial assistants, who are MFA students in the creative writing program whose studies and work here are supported by a generous Graduate Incentives in Growth Award from the Graduate College. Those are Laura, Tommy, and Erin, and they'll be reading tonight. And our faithful undergraduate intern, Katie, who will be reading tonight too. She's attended weekly meetings all year to work on Fairy Tale Review, Journal of Fairy Tales that we publish here, and to plan this event. So thanks to all of you. We're also grateful to the Department of English, our other major sponsor, and the Office of Student Affairs for our wonderful faculty-student interaction grant. And if you could sign in on the clipboard, that would help, because then we justify our grant, because we interacted tonight. Which is so great, this kind of interaction. To have a multi-generational gathering like this is so meaningful. Welcome back, especially to Tucson, Timothy, our guest reader who flew in from Nebraska last night just to join us here for this celebration of Oz. And Timothy and I met 20 years ago as students here at the University of Arizona, quite possibly at a rather literary bar called Tequila Mockingbird. That no longer exists, I believe. It was in a strip mall, right? Yeah. Anybody else remember it? I vaguely remember it. Tonight, we're going to open with a short video clip, and then we'll follow with an introduction that we'll give to you, and that'll send us straight into the readings from the Oz books, and we'll close with another short video, and a reception immediately follows. And during the reception, for those of you who came in late, we'll be playing the video loop that has just been playing now. So you can catch a glimpse of the many iterations of Oz over the ages in art, music, film, etc. So thanks for coming, and sit back, relax, and welcome to Oz.
I'm Timothy Schaffert. In L. Frank Baum's introduction to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the author indicates that his story aspires to being a modernized fairy tale, in opposition to the historical stories, with all their, quote, horrible and blood-curdling incident. Modern tales don't require a moral, he argues, therefore children's fiction need only entertain. And yet, what has always thrilled me about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from my childhood on is its horror and mystery. Not only its witches and their vicious, deadly rivalries, and all the threat lurking in Dorothy's journey, but also in the less obvious anxieties. Dorothy is without parents, but somehow her bravery seems explained by her orphanhood, as does her maternal nature in gathering her odd collection of traveling companions. Her trust is both comforting and terrifying somehow.
The New York Times review of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz announced in 1900, "It will indeed be strange if there be a normal child who will not enjoy the story." This emphasis on the normal, cheery appeal of the book strikes me as sort of outlandish, but I guess it worked. For me, and I wasn't a normal child, this book fit right in with all of the mysterious fairy tale books I encountered. I don't know that I differentiated at all between it and the Andrew Lang series, the Brothers Grimm, or Hans Christian Andersen. These were all fairy tale collections, serial, authorless works that existed together in a whole universe. As a reader in childhood, I did not wonder why the Oz books had one hero, Dorothy, while the other books of fairy tales had many heroes. They were all interchangeable for me. That was their beauty. I read the series perhaps as you did, as a child hungry for adventure, mystery, and consolation. However, maybe there was a slight difference, which I'd like to pinpoint. It's not that this was a modernized fairy tale precisely. I knew nothing about that. But I do think that the primary sensation I got from Baum's writing, as I did from, say, Lewis Carroll's, was more tilted toward dread than consolation, like you. Not dread toward you, but The Wonderful Wizard of Oz scared me so much more than the Grimm fairy tales, which really didn't scare me at all. I remember being especially distressed by an exchange about Toto, wherein Dorothy's asked, and I paraphrase here to get to the essence of this, and I think we might have an excerpt that echoes this, but Dorothy's asked, "Is that a meat dog?" The idea of a meat dog was weirder to me than any hedgehog or ogre in the Grimm Brothers books. I had a meat dog, a dachshund. Maybe the Oz books were more representational, which I've always experienced as a technique laden with dread.
And at the time of my first reading the tales of Grimm, Andersen, and Perrault, I hadn't any geographical reference for them. They all seemed to take place in a vaguely ancient and distant land where even the moral conflicts were cloudy and foreign. It seemed to me the heroes and heroines were doomed from the get-go, their tragedies predestined. But The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was close to home. Dorothy's Kansas was just across the state line, and the wizard's balloon promoted a fair in Omaha. And though most of the story takes place in Oz and surrounding fantasy lands, there are agrarian influences throughout. I could see the Tin Woodsman and the scrap metal out back on my own farm, and we resorted to all sorts of scarecrow-like decoys in the garden and barns. And if I remember right, the movie played on television every spring just before tornado season. I don't know if all that necessarily contributed to that dread you reference, which I felt too, but it certainly sharpened the tale's edges and made them a bit more jagged and rusty.
At the time of my first reading of the European fairy tales, they seemed close to home, very real. I grew up in a house that sat next to a woods. The Grimm tales sometimes mentioned town names, Bremen, for example, and I lived in a town named Waben. There it is. Ah. Named Waben, and I could imagine it inside an old fairy tale book. The Grimm tales made my everyday world feel more magical to me, but the setting of Kansas had more abstraction and mystery for me as a reader, not growing up there and not having traveled there at all as a child. Kansas could have just as easily been Alpha Centauri. I could not imagine going somewhere like Kansas or Oz, and that was part of the attraction. It was a place that only seemed to exist inside a book. My mother loved the movie and even has the Andy Warhol print of the Wicked Witch hanging in our dining room to terrorize us. My primary memory, it's huge too, it's bigger than that. My primary memory of the movie is frantically running out of the room whenever the flying monkeys entered a scene. The movie and the book series were really distant for me from each other. I loved Ozma of Oz and Queen Zixi of Ix so much. Did you have any favorites, Timothy?
Well, the landscapes of fairy tales did feel familiar to me too, even if I couldn't quite place them on a map. Contrarily, whenever I read anything as a child, I often pictured the story taking place in a world I'd encountered nearby. I could easily picture the baby Moses set adrift in the irrigation creek that crossed through our pasture. And somehow, the Oz of the book felt less fantastical than the Oz in the movie, largely due to Denslow's illustrations. They were a mix of grit and whimsy. In the movie, the Wicked Witch, with her green skin and black dress, seemed a horror show invention, while the witches illustrated by Denslow looked like a bedraggled carny in a thrift shop costume, someone who might pass through your town any day of any summer and linger until she was rustled out. The Patchwork Girl, her story was among my favorites of the Oz books, impressed me similarly, as illustrated by John Neal, She was like no rag doll I'd ever seen, and yet if I did ever see one, she'd look exactly like that, I was certain.
That's the feeling I remember getting from so many magical books as a kid. They seemed exactly as I imagined they might be. I also love the Patchwork Girl, really the whole Baum series, from my favorites to my least favorites. And of course, there were books in this series I was more indifferent to than others, as it always is in life. In a way, that was just part of the whole adventure. That duller book is necessary. It's disappointments and obstacles necessary to the next enlightenment. Pretty lifelike, I guess. On the whole, I just wanted more. To enter Oz was like mind reading, very occult. It's amazing to revisit the whole confounding series. Fairy Tale Review's assistant editors and I have found really fascinating connections in our reading of the series, and you'll hear echoes of this tonight, and in our foray into Oz scholarship to the disciplines of economics, border studies, philosophy, physics, film, gender studies, literature of the sublime. We each have our own Oz, we are finding. Did you reread the series as we gathered the work for the Emerald issue of Fairy Tale Review and prepared for this event, Timothy? And as you completed your newest novel, The Swan Gondola, with its Baum themes?
Well, you're much more patient with the duller books than I've ever been. I'm no Oz scholar, so I've abandoned a few to mere skimming. But while writing The Swan Gondola, I imagine my novel as a bit of Oz apocrypha, as a portrait of the life and loves of Oz in Omaha and what led him to build the Emerald City from a farm's scrap metal. So I returned to the original book again and again, sometimes picking it up somewhere in the middle or at the end. As a result, it remains vaguely discombobulated in my brain. But the novel always did seem somewhat scattershot in its storytelling. The more times I read the book, the more lost I get, forgetting what comes next. I recommend this approach to the series. The parts are definitely greater than the sum.
And now to parts of the series with a brief moment of silence introduced by Larry Evers from the Department of English.
About 10 years ago, my colleagues N. Scott Momaday and Dick Shelton, Richard Shelton, both now retired, and I had a student in the American Indian Studies program. His name's Mac Hudson. Mac, it turns out, is the great-great-grandson of L. Frank Baum. Mac taught me a lot about Baum as he worked on his master's thesis. He taught me that in addition to being the author of the Oz series, his great-great-grandfather was also the owner and publisher of the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, a small-town newspaper. And that as a newspaper man, L. Frank Baum wrote 2 editorials calling for, quote, the total extermination of the Indians. One published just before and one just after a mass murder of more than 150 Lakota Indians on December 29, 1890 at Wounded Knee, not far from where Baum published his newspaper in South Dakota. For himself, for his family, for all of us, Mac Hudson wanted to take account and try to reckon with his great-great-grandfather's extermination editorials in relation to Wounded Knee and to the wonder and power of Baum's other writing. So Mac did that in his thesis and completed a brave, beautifully written, and nuanced work. Along the way, Mac and other members of his family traveled back to South Dakota, where they offered a formal apology to descendants of the survivors of Wounded Knee. Mac's words from that occasion are, I hope, on the slide behind me. He said, "It is important that we acknowledge the racism of the past and look for opportunities to correct the racism of today." Let's join together now in a moment of silence so that we may reflect on Mac's message.
Thank you, Larry. This is an excerpt from Ozma of Oz. Hearing this condition imposed by the Gnome King, Ozma became silent and thoughtful, and all her friends looked at her uneasily. "Don't you do it," exclaimed Dorothy. "If you guess wrong, you will be enslaved yourself." "But I shall have 11 guesses," answered Ozma. "Surely I ought to guess one object in 11 correctly, and if I do, I shall rescue one of the royal family and be safe myself. Then the rest of you may attempt it, and soon we shall free all of those who are enslaved." "What if we fail?" inquired the Scarecrow. "I'd look nice as a piece of bric-a-brac, wouldn't I?" "We must not fail," cried Ozma courageously. "Having come all this distance to free these poor people, it would be weak and cowardly in us to abandon the adventure. Therefore, I will accept the Gnome King's offer and go at once into the royal palace." "Come along then, my dear," said the king, climbing down from his throne with some difficulty because he was so fat. "I'll show you the way." He approached a wall of the cave and waved his hand. Instantly an opening appeared, through which Ozma, after a smiling farewell to her friends, boldly passed. She found herself in a splendid hall that was more beautiful and grand than anything she had ever beheld. The ceilings were composed of great arches that rose far above her head, and all the walls and floors were of polished marble exquisitely tinted in many colors. Thick velvet carpets were on the floor, and heavy silken draperies covered the arches leading to the various rooms of the palace. The furniture was made of rare old woods, richly carved and covered with delicate satins, and the entire palace was lighted by a mysterious rosy glow that seemed to come from no particular place, but flooded each apartment with its soft and pleasing radiance. Ozma passed from one room to another, greatly delighted by all she saw. The lovely palace had no other occupant, for the Gnome King had left her at the entrance, which closed behind her, and in all the magnificent rooms there appeared to be no other person. Upon the mantels, and upon the many shelves and brackets and tables, were clustered ornaments of every description, seemingly made out of all sorts of metals, glass, china, stones, and marbles. There were vases and figures of men and animals, engraven platters and bowls, and mosaics of precious gems, and many other things. Pictures, too, were on the walls, and in the underground palace was quite a museum of rare and curious and costly objects. After her first hasty examination of the rooms, Ozma began to wonder which of all the numerous ornaments that they contained were the transformations of the royal family of Ev. There was nothing to guide her, for everything seemed without a spark of life. So she must guess blindly, and for the first time the girl came to realize how dangerous was her task, and how likely she was to lose her own freedom in striving to free others from the bondage of the Gnome King. No wonder the cunning monarch laughed good-naturedly with his visitors when he knew how easily they might be entrapped. But Ozma, having undertaken the venture, would not abandon it. She looked at a silver candelabra that had 10 branches and thought, "This may be the Queen of Ev and her 10 children." So she touched it and uttered aloud the word, "Ev," as the Gnome King had instructed her to do when she guessed, but the candelabra remained as before. Then she wandered into another room and touched a china lamb. Thinking it might be one of the children, she sought, but again she was unsuccessful. 3 guesses, 4 guesses, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 she made, and still not one of them was right. The girl shivered a little and grew pale, even under the rosy light. But for now, one guess remained, and her own fate depended upon the result. She resolved not to be hasty, and strolled through all the rooms once more, gazing earnestly upon the various ornaments and trying to decide which she would touch. Finally, in despair, she decided to leave it entirely to chance. She faced the doorways of a room, shut her eyes tightly, and then, thrusting aside the heavy draperies, she advanced blindly with her right arm outstretched before her. So slowly, softly, she crept forward until her hand came in contact with an object upon a small round table. She did not know what it was, but in a low voice she pronounced the word, Ev. The rooms were quite empty of life after that. The Gnome King had gained a new ornament, for upon the edge of the table rested a pretty grasshopper that seemed to have been formed from a single emerald. It was all that remained of Ozma of Oz. In the throne room just beyond the palace, the Gnome King suddenly looked up and smiled. "Next," he said in his pleasant voice. Dorothy, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman, who had been sitting in anxious silence, each gave a start of dismay and stared into one another's eyes. "Has she failed?" asked Tick-Tock. "So it seems," asked the little monarch cheerfully. "But that is no reason one of you should not succeed. The next may have 12 guesses instead of 11, for there are now 12 persons transformed into ornaments. Well, well, which of you goes next? I'll go, said Dorothy. Not so, replied the Tin Woodman. As commander of Ozma's army, it is my privilege to follow her and attempt her rescue. Away you go, then, said the Scarecrow. Be careful, old friend. I will, promised the Tin Woodman, and then he followed the Gnome King to the entrance to the palace, and the rock closed behind them.
There came from the forest a terrible roar, and the next moment a great lion bounded into the road. With one blow of his paw, he sent the Scarecrow spinning over and over to the edge of the road, and then he struck the Tin Woodman with his sharp claws. But, to the lion's surprise, he could make no impression on the tin, although the woodman fell over in the road and lay still. Little Toto, now that he had an enemy to face, ran barking towards the lion, and the great beast had opened his mouth to bite the dog, when Dorothy, fearing Toto would be killed and heedless of danger, rushed forward and slapped the lion upon his nose as hard as she could, while she cried out,
"Don't you dare to bite Toto! You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a big beast like you, to bite a poor little dog."
I didn't bite him,
said the lion as he rubbed his nose with his paw where Dorothy had hit it.
"No, but you tried to,"
she retorted.
"You are nothing but a big coward."
I know it.
Said the lion, hanging his head in shame.
I've always known it. But how can I help it?
"I don't know, I'm sure. To think of your striking a stuffed man like the poor Scarecrow."
Is he stuffed?
Asked the lion in surprise as he watched her pick up the Scarecrow and set him upon his feet, while she patted him into shape again.
"Of course he's stuffed,"
replied Dorothy, who was still angry.
That's why he went over so easily,
remarked the lion.
It astonished me to see him whirl around so. Is the other one stuffed also?
"No,"
said Dorothy,
"he's made of tin."
and she helped the woodman up again.
That's why he nearly blunted my claws,
said the lion.
When they scratched against the tin, it made a cold shiver run down my back. What is that little animal you are so tender of?
"He's my dog, Toto,"
answered Dorothy.
Is he made of tin or stuffed?
"Neither. He's a meat dog,"
said the girl.
Oh, he's a curious animal, and seems remarkably small now that I look at him. No one would think of biting such a little thing, except a coward like me,
continued the lion sadly.
"What makes you a coward?"
asked Dorothy, looking at the great beast in wonder, for he was as big as a small horse.
It's a mystery,
replied the lion.
I suppose I was born that way. All the other animals in the forest naturally expect me to be brave, for the lion is everywhere thought to be the king of beasts. I learned that if I roared very loudly, every living thing was frightened and got out of my way. Whenever I've met a man, I've been awfully scared, but I just roared at him, and he has always run away as fast as he could go. If the elephants and tigers and the bears had ever tried to fight me, I should have run myself. I'm such a coward. But just as soon as they hear me roar, they all try to get away from me, and of course, I let them go.
The cat was made of glass, so clear and transparent that you could see through it as easily as through a window. In the top of its head, however, was a mass of delicate pink balls, which looked like jewels, and it had a heart made of a blood-red ruby. The eyes were two large emeralds, but aside from these colors, all the rest of the animal was clear glass, and it had a spun glass tail that was really beautiful. "Well, Doc Pipt, do you mean to introduce us or not?" demanded the cat in a tone of annoyance. "Seems to me you're forgetting your manners." "Excuse me," returned the magician. "This is Unk Nunky, the descendant of the former kings of the Munchkins, before this country became a part of the land of Oz." "He needs a haircut," observed the cat, washing its face. "True," replied Unc with a low chuckle of amusement. But he's lived alone in the heart of the forest for many years, the magician explained. And although that is a barbarous country, there are no barbers there. Who's the dwarf? Asked the cat. That is not a dwarf, but a boy, answered the magician. You've never seen a boy before. He is now small because he is young. With more years, he will grow big and become as tall as Unc Nunkie. Oh, is that magic? The glass animal inquired. Yes, but it is nature's magic, which is more wonderful than any art known to man. For instance, my magic made you, and made you live, and it was a poor job because you were useless and a bother to me. But I can't make you grow. You will always be the same size, and the same saucy, inconsiderate glass cat, with pink brains and a hard ruby heart. No one can regret more than I the fact that you made me, asserted the cat, crouching upon the floor and slowly swaying his spun glass tail from side to side. Your world is a very uninteresting place. I've wandered through your gardens and in the forest until I'm tired of it all. And when I come into the house, the conversation of your fat wife and of yourself bores me dreadfully.
About the middle of the forenoon, they began to go up a long hill. By and by, this hill suddenly dropped down into a pretty valley, where the travelers saw to their surprise a small house standing by the roadside. It was the first house they had seen, and they hastened into the valley to discover who lived there. No one was in sight as they approached, but when they began to get nearer the house, they heard queer sounds coming from it. They could not make these out at first, but as they became louder, our friends thought they heard a sort of music like that made by a wheezy hand organ. The music fell upon their ears in this way. Tiddle widdle iddle, pum pum, pum pum, pum pum. Tiddle tiddle tiddle, pum pum, pum pum pa. What is it? A band or a mouth organ? Asked Dorothy. Don't know, said Button Bright. Sounds to me like a played-out phonograph, said the Shaggy Man, lifting his enormous ears to listen. Oh, there just couldn't be a phonograph in fairyland, cried Dorothy. It's rather pretty, isn't it? Asked Polychrome, trying to dance to the strings. Tiddle widdle iddle, pum pum, pum pum, pum pum, came the music to their ears, more distinctly as they drew nearer the house. Presently, they saw a little fat man sitting on a bench before the door. He wore a red braided jacket that reached to his waist, a blue waistcoat, and white trousers with gold stripes down the sides. On his bald head was perched a little round red cap, held in place by a rubber elastic underneath his chin. His face was round, his eyes a faded blue, and he wore white cotton gloves. The man leaned on a stout, gold-headed cane, bending forward on his seat to watch his visitors approach. Singularly enough, the musical sounds they had heard seemed to come from the inside of the fat man himself. For he was playing no instrument, nor was any to be seen near him.
During the rest of the day, there was no other adventure to mar the peace of their journey. Once, indeed, the Tin Woodman stepped upon a beetle that was crawling along the road and killed the poor little thing. This made the Tin Woodman very unhappy, for he was always careful not to hurt any living creature, and as he walked along, he wept several tears of sorrow and regret. These tears ran slowly down his face and over the hinges of his jaw, and there they rusted. When Dorothy presently asked him a question, The Tin Woodman could not open his mouth, for his jaws were tightly rusted together. He became greatly frightened at this, and made many motions to Dorothy to relieve him, but she could not understand. The Lion was also puzzled to know what was wrong. But the Scarecrow seized the oil can from Dorothy's basket and oiled the Woodman's jaws, so that after a few moments he could talk as well as before. "This will serve me a lesson," said he, "to look where I step. For if I should kill another bug or beetle, I should surely cry again, and crying rests my jaws so that I cannot speak." Thereafter he walked very carefully, with his eyes on the road, and when he saw a tiny ant toiling by, he would step over it, so as not to harm it. The Tin Woodman knew very well he had no heart, and therefore he took great care never to be cruel or unkind to anything. "You people with hearts," he said, "you have something to guide you. You need never do wrong. But I have no heart, and so I must be very careful. When Oz gives me a heart, of course, I needn't mind so much."
I am sorry you were not with us tonight, for we have had rare sport. See, we have woven a magic cloak.
Ariel examined the garment with pleasure.
"And who is to wear it?" she asked.
Then again arose the good-natured dispute as to which mortal in all the world should possess the magic cloak. Finally, the Queen, laughing at the arguments of her band, said to them,
"Come, let us leave the decision to the Man in the Moon. He has been watching us with a great deal of amusement, and once, I am sure, I caught him winking at us in quite a roguish way."
At this, every head was turned toward the moon, and then a man's face, full bearded and wrinkled, but with a jolly look upon the rough features, appeared sharply defined on the moon's broad surface. "So, I'm to decide another dispute, eh?" said he in a clear voice. "Well, my dears, what is it this time?"
"We wish you to say what mortal shall wear the magic cloak which I and the ladies of my court have woven," replied Queen Lulea.
"Give it to the first unhappy person you meet," said the Man in the Moon. "The happy mortals have no need of magic cloaks." And with this advice, the friendly face of the Man in the Moon faded away until only the outlines remained visible against the silver disk.
The Queen clapped her hands delightedly. "Our Man in the Moon is very wise," she declared, "and we shall follow his suggestion. Go, Ariel, since you are free for a time, and carry the magic cloak to Noland. And the first person you meet who is really unhappy, be it man, woman, or child, shall receive from you the cloak as a gift from our fairy band."
Ariel bowed and folded the cloak over her arm.
"Come, my children," continued Lulea. "The moon is hiding behind the treetops, and it is time for us to depart."
A moment later, the fairies had disappeared, and the clearing wherein they had danced and woven the magic cloak lay shrouded in deepest gloom.
The witch squatted upon the ground and kindled a tiny fire of dried herbs, which she drew from her bosom. When the blaze shot up and burned clearly, old Mombi scattered a handful of magical powder over the fire, which straightway gave off a rich violet vapor, filling all the tent with its fragrance, and forcing the sawhorse to sneeze, although he had been warned to keep quiet. Then, while the others watched her curiously, the hag chanted a rhythmical verse in words which no one understood, and bent her lean body several times back and forth over the fire. And now the incantation seemed complete, for the witch stood upright and cried the one word, "Yawa," in a loud voice. The vapor floated away. The atmosphere became clear again. A whiff of fresh air filled the tent, and the pink curtains of the couch trembled slightly, as if stirred from within. Glinda walked over to the canopy and parted the silken hangings. Then she bent over the cushions, reached out her hand, and from the couch arose the form of a young girl, fresh and beautiful as a May morning. Her eyes sparkled as two diamonds, and her lips were tinted like tourmaline. All down her back floated tresses of ruddy gold, with a slender jeweled circlet confining them at the brow. The robes of silken gauze floated around her like a cloud, and dainty satin slippers shod her feet. At this exquisite vision, Tip's old comrade stared in wonder for the space of a full minute, and then every head bent low in honest admiration of the lovely Princess Ozma. The girl herself cast one look into Glinda's bright face, which glowed with pleasure and satisfaction, and then turned upon the others. Speaking the words with sweet diffidence, she said, "I hope none of you will care less for me than you did before. I'm just the same Tip, you know, only you're different," said the Pumpkinhead, and everyone thought it was the wisest speech he had ever made.
As I mentioned in the introduction, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and I was fascinated by the fact that this iconographic literary figure was originally from Omaha. We don't learn much about the Wizard's history with Omaha, but I thought I would read a section from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz where he speaks to it. "I was born in Omaha." "Why, that isn't very far from Kansas," cried Dorothy. "No, but it's farther from here," he said, shaking his head at her sadly. "When I grew up, I became a ventriloquist, and at that I was very well trained by a great master. I can imitate any kind of bird or beast." Here he mewed so like a kitten that Toto pricked up his ears and looked everywhere to see where she was. "After a time," continued Oz, "I tired of that and became a balloonist." "What is that?" asked Dorothy. "A man who goes up in a balloon on circus day so as to draw a crowd of people together and get them to pay to see the circus," he explained. "Oh," she said, "I know." The wizard then inspired the character in my novel, The Swan Gondola, a ventriloquist named Ferret Scarret, who trained with a master ventriloquist, a librarian named Mr. Crow. And Crow at this point has died after they had been planning to go to the World's Fair in Paris. Ventriloquism possessed me, and I became expert at the art. In the beginning, I imagined my act as something transcendent. When I got into character, like an actor, Crow's voice spoke through me. But soon enough, I became more practical-minded about it all. I strengthened my voice by saying not a word, speaking only when rehearsing, spending all my time sucking lemons and gargling tepid water, warming my throat by day with a scarf, even in the summer months. At night, I pressed a cold compress to my neck and tied it there with a strip of flannel. When practicing, I stood in front of a mirror to watch for any twitch of my lips. The lip-heavy P's and B's were impossible, so I avoided all mention of pianos and bustles. When a letter trembled my mouth too much, I did what I could to alter the word, changing its sound, reinventing the language as I went along. I spoke softer and softer, pushing each letter farther and farther back into my mouth until every word I ever knew vanished from my lips. I cupped my hands at my ears to hear the seashell sound of a crashing ocean and to listen for the voice of my character in the distance.
That's a tough act to follow. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the movie, The Wizard of Oz, and just to hear excerpts from the series and to celebrate new lands and places like home. We have a reception now with music from the great Tucson band, Greasy Light Orchestra, and there's snacks and just mill about. We also have a video loop that some of you caught at the beginning that will play throughout the reception. So come and go as you please. And thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful evening.